Okay, I think we'll get going then. Welcome to this event about rising costs, and welcome everybody. It's good to see so many people have come along. It shows what an important issue this is currently. Welcome to our Heritage Trust Network event. I think most of you know who we are. We're a membership organisation for charities, trusts, social enterprises, community organisations that are rescuing, restoring, finding new uses for and managing historic buildings and spaces. As I said previously, or do feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, and also as you start to think of questions, also pop them in there. We'll keep an eye on it. This session is being recorded. On the top left of your screen, you should see something about Otter AI. That gives you quite a good live transcript of the session. So if you have difficulty hearing, that's a good way of getting a transcript, which you might want anyway. This session will be, as I said, is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our website. So we have a interesting panel for you today of consultants and funders. As I said, we've noticed this phenomena of rising costs for contractors is very current among our members, but it's also about lack of availability of contractors and delays in getting projects completed because of that. This event's to explore what's happening, why it's happening, what we can do about it. And I guess what we can do about it is on two levels: how we can influence policymakers and funders, and what we can do about it on a practical level as project managers. So what I'm going to start off with is to ask our panelists what their experience is of the issues, and then we'll go on to talk about ways of dealing with them later. But I just briefly wanted to go around and get a feel for what people's experience of the issues is. So first of all, I'm going to go to Stephen Anderson, Director of Buttress Architects and Chair of Valley Heritage. Buttress Architects are one of our partner members. That's businesses that choose to support the Heritage Trust Network and participate in our events and get a number of other benefits from doing so. So we're very pleased to be able to have Stephen here today. Buttress are based in Manchester, leading design studio, providing architecture, urban design, interiors and conservation design services. And they've got an amazing portfolio of conservation, restoration and creative reuse projects. And Stephen's a stalwart of our Northwest branch and has particularly promoted the adoption of BIM within Buttress and applied it to historic buildings. So Stephen, I'm going to ask you, how are you finding the situation at the moment?
Morning all, and thanks David. After that build up, I better say something vaguely intelligent, hadn't I? There's maybe a couple of experiences that I've had. I'll kind of pick on a slightly more personal one and a professional one. So on a more personal note, I chair Valley Heritage, which is a heritage development trust operating in Pennine, Lancashire, the Rosendale area. And we've got a project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And we got to a point where we thought we had all of our funding in place. We put it out to tender with tender returns just in the new year this year, and found that they came back. It was about 80% over budget, and it was quite a significant challenge. We went through a value engineering process to try and bring down those costs to a manageable level, realised it wasn't achievable without destroying the project. And we've had to go out and seek additional funding basically from more than one source. So we're getting there with that process, but it's delayed the project by about 6 months. And there are some tricky business plan issues that come out of that delay. So I've got kind of first-hand bitter experience of the challenges that many people on this call will be facing at the moment. Then on a professional level, the one that perhaps brought it home to me most recently is I'm acting as a monitor for National Lottery Heritage Fund on a project in the Midlands that had tender returns. It was about 2 months ago the tenders were returned. And the tender documents were really, really good, very, very detailed. Bill of quantities, for those that are familiar with that kind of terminology, really well put together. And we had tender returns that were all over budget, but the range was from, maybe 15% over budget up to, I think it was about 150% over budget, so more than double. Now that is incredibly unusual with a bill of quantities with that level of detail. You normally get quite tight tender returns that come back within quite a narrow range. So that was quite an eye-opening experience. And fortunately for that particular project, they were able to do some relatively light value engineering and get it back within budget, and have appointed contractors now to move that one forward, and experienced only a short delay as a result of that. But that was, I think, luck under the circumstances more than judgment. And yeah, they're fortunate in that they can move forward. So yeah, there's a couple of experiences to kind of throw out there to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to move on to Eleanor Clarke, who's a partner in Focus Consultants. Focus are another partner member of the Heritage Trust Network, so very pleased to have them here today. They were founded in Nottingham in 1994 and are originally sort of project management, regeneration consultants, broadened out into surveying, quantity surveying, sustainability. And Eleanor's started life as a QS, but has become more of a project management and procurement consultant who's delivered some very high profile and prestigious projects within the cultural and heritage sector. So Eleanor, perhaps you can tell us about your recent experiences and also perhaps touch on what do you think is causing this phenomenon.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, David. And yeah, as Stephen says, quite a build up. Yeah, well, I can only echo what Stephen's saying and what some of you are saying within the chat as well. It's tough out there. And, we've spent the last 18 months talking about unprecedented times in terms of sort of COVID. And actually, this really is unprecedented times in the construction industry even, and you sort of have to go back to the 90s and sort of some of the price fluctuations we were seeing then to really get something that's anywhere near the rise that we're seeing, and just that fluidity of pricing. We've got, in sort of a similar vein to what Stephen was just talking about, one of our projects, we're in a two-stage tender process. We ended up going two-stage, which is where you get the contractor engaged on fairly limited information before progressing more detailed information to a detailed pricing document. Ended up having to go that route simply because contractors weren't interested in engaging on a sort of full tender process. And during this second stage tender part, as we've been negotiating, they've been talking to their supply chains almost week by week. We're getting increases in pricing. In the last month, we've sort of had steel prices go up another 30%, timber prices go up 40–50%, MDMF sort of another 30–40%. So it really is problematic. And I think, many of you are probably already aware, but it is worth just kind of looking at why we're in such a strange times. And I think we've got kind of a combination of push and pull factors. So from the supply chain point of view, we've got the sort of COVID and Brexit effect. So Brexit, which we all sort of forgot about with COVID taking over. But we were expecting a departure from the labour market from Brexit. What COVID did was accelerate that effect. And obviously construction relies a lot on labour from Europe. And with the lockdowns, a lot of that labour chose to go home during lockdown, and then they simply haven't returned. So there's a sort of a labour shortage. There was manufacturing stopped, so we sort of saw factories shut down, which created shortages in supply chains. We also ended up with containers sort of stuck in the wrong places of the world, as they weren't able to move between countries and continents with the different border controls that countries are putting in. So that means you basically got supplies in the wrong place, you've got shipping in the wrong place. Then there was the Suez Canal blockages, which some of you may be familiar with, which has exacerbated that. And very finally, sort of a smaller one, but there's an increase in tax applying to white goods. I think it's at the end of June in certain parts of the world, which means that containers are prioritised, shipping companies are prioritising white goods shipping over construction materials. So all of that means that we're not getting materials into the country. We're also seeing with things like steel, they're favouring European markets because we haven't got the resale price, we haven't got the scrap price sort of holding. So that's sort of all on the supply factor. And then on the demand side, we've got government basically sort of trying to spend their way out of it. They were already planning to with Brexit. They probably, were going to continue that with COVID. We've got the large infrastructure projects like HS2, the pushing on the housing, pushing on hospitals, schools. And then at a smaller local level, which will be sort of affecting some of the contractors, you'll be working on your smaller projects. People have been sat at home, they haven't been going on holiday. So we're seeing a surge of home renovations, sort of smaller projects that people have been sat around the house wondering what to do. They've not spent their money on holiday, so they're spending on doing that house. So that's also creating this kind of increased supply at even the smaller level, as well as those large infrastructure projects. And then, of course, you've got all the projects that perhaps paused during the pandemic that are getting restarted. So it is really kind of a culmination of so many different sort of supply and demand factors, which doesn't help, but at least sort of gives you sort of an understanding. And I think the other reason why it's important, and we'll come on to this later, is how long is this going to last for? Because that's really important when you're considering your timescales for your project, and what decisions do you take now, what decisions do you defer?
Okay, thank you, Eleanor, and I can confirm. I'm looking out of my window at the moment at a landscape project that's going on in my park, and it's being delivered by a lovely bunch of Albanians who fortunately got stuck here rather than there. So we've been lucky in that respect, but we've certainly suffered from material shortages, and there's also a general sort of HGV driver shortage, which means things don't get delivered. So I'm going to go to our funders now on our panel, and first of all to Gordon Barr, who's the development manager in Scotland for the Architectural Heritage Fund. Architectural Heritage Fund are, strong partners of ours, and put in the initial funding to many of our members' projects, and we work closely with them, particularly in Scotland, where we also have our own development officer. There's a very strong partnership up there. Gordon's been with the AHF since 2014, and before that was Heritage Development Manager for Maryhill Burr Hall's project, and apparently knows all about cinema and theatre heritage in Scotland, and he's a trustee of Linlithgow Heritage Trust. So Gordon, over to you.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everybody. So the Architectural Heritage Fund works across the UK. First thing, so I'm here as the Scotland rep, if you like, but we see the same sorts of issues right across the UK. And I suppose the main thing to try to say, to be slightly reassuring, is for all these projects seeing these increases in costs, is that you're not alone. It's not something you've done wrong. Some people are saying the QS let us down. This happens. No, it's not your fault. It's happening everywhere, and I think as we've already touched on a lot of the kind of key points, but I think the kind of impact it's having on projects is quite different depending on kind of where in a sort of project life cycle projects are. If you're fundraising now and your costs are going up, that's one hill to surmount. We've heard about tenders coming back much more expensive than expected, and that's a different problem to have, revisiting, talking to existing funders, trying to plug gaps through various techniques. I think there's, as we've heard, there's the complexities and additional costs of materials. There's the shortage of materials. Things are taking longer, have taken longer because of COVID restrictions and things as well. And I think one of the elements we've been seeing in a couple of projects we're involved in, and just to take a step back briefly, the HF, we provide largely relatively small scale early stage development grants to help projects get going, but we also provide social investment through loans, other types of social investment much further on in the project's life cycle, including during capital delivery phase and also once projects are up and running in historic buildings. So we do see projects talking to us at all stages. And one of the bits of feedback I've had recently was about a project that was on site at present, that it's taking much longer than one was programmed and budgeted for, simply because of the number of contractors they can have on site at any one time is much more restricted because of COVID restrictions and very reasonable safety precautions. But they would normally expect to have 20 to 25 contractors on site on an average day. They can have a maximum of 6 because of the way the site's laid out and the difficulties of moving through it, etc. And the kind of knock-on implications of that for program delivery, as well as never mind the stuff's more expensive. Once you can get, when it arrives, can you get it on site on time? So there's a lot of these sorts of, complex interconnecting details. And I think the really interesting question, as Ellie mentioned there, is how long is this going to go on for? If you've got a project that you're fundraising for now or trying to establish some costs for now that's going to be on site in 2 or 3 or 4 years time, do we plan for things to keep going up? Do we plan for things hopefully to level off and go down? How do we try and plan for that? And I suppose that's some of the things that we hopefully can come out in the later stage of the discussion today. But I think that's kind of thing. I think as I say, the key thing as a funder is we're very supportive. We understand. We don't necessarily have any more money to give you, which is the problem. But I think the key message is talk to your funders, make sure they're on board, make sure they understand what's happening, what they're going through. And if they can help you, they will try to help you, generally speaking. I can't speak for all funders officially, but that we understand, but talk to us, make sure we know where you're at, keep us up to date. We definitely can't help you if you don't know there's a problem.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Finally, we go to Liz Bates. Liz is the Head of Investments for England Midlands and East at the Heritage Lottery Fund and Chair of the Heritage Trust Network. Hooray. Liz has worked in historic building conservation for over 15 years and has been in her current job at the National Lottery Heritage Fund for about a year. She's the former Chief Exec of Heritage Lincolnshire and previously worked for the National Trust and the University of Nottingham. So Liz, what have you been finding at the Heritage Fund?
Thanks, David. Morning, everybody. Yeah, I've been with the Heritage Fund for a year now, and I've only left my dining room about 4 times. So this is all intelligence that I've gathered by this lovely medium that we're talking to you on now. But I mean, I would just reiterate what Gordon said about that message about talking to your funder and keeping us informed is absolutely right. And that very much works for the Heritage Lottery Fund as well. And so do keep us involved. We're trying to be as flexible and supportive as we possibly can be with our grantees at the moment, because for all of the reasons Ellie's just outlined, this is an unprecedented situation. And as Gordon said, we don't expect you to have seen this coming. So we very much want to talk to you and work with you to get through all of these challenges that you're facing at the moment. So in terms of what we're seeing, projects that are already in delivery, we've had quite a lot of challenges with our current investment. For all the reasons that have been discussed, we're seeing projects that are facing delays to programmes because of difficulties with materials, and a lack of specialist subcontractors as well is causing quite a lot of problems. Major cost increases that are coming down the line, extension requests from contractors through the various lockdowns is all having an impact. And we're actually starting to see some disputes with contractors starting to come up as well with grantees. So it's worth sort of understanding that, you know, you want to work with your profession, your design team and your contractors to try and avoid it getting to that situation. And as Stephen said, this all has a knock-on impact in our project on the delivery of the activities and the business plans that come after that. So we're very aware of that as well. And we've been working with grantees to try and address those challenges as well. I mean, I think what this has highlighted for me overall is that it's ever more important for grantees to be an informed client. You need to know exactly, you need to be on top of the management of your project, be on top of your design team, be working collaboratively with your contractor, but to understand your contracts, understand the work that's being delivered, understand the different impacts that these delays are going to make, and make sure that your risk management document is a live document and you're absolutely on top of that as well. So if you don't have those skills on your team already from a client perspective, as in from your trust perspective or your organisation, it's really worthwhile trying to get that in place before you embark on a project. And then for projects that we've got at development stage at the moment, we're seeing as cost plans come forward, as estimates come forward, and as you say, each time they're coming back in a little bit more and a little bit more. There's a lot of value engineering going on. There's a lot of scaling back of projects. And what we've got to be careful about there is that the projects still meet the approved purposes for which the committees gave the grant in the first place. So think about how you're building up your projects from that point of view. It's worthwhile developing all the different parts of your project at the same time, because what we're seeing a lot of is people are concentrating on the development of their capital scheme. That's going forward really quickly, and then it's delayed while the project team catch up with all the rest of it, all the activity plans and the business planning and all the rest of it. In the meantime, your costs are going up all the time. So that's something to think about. And just one more point before I hand back over to you, David. Not enough people are making use of enabling and urgent works opportunities in their development phases. And I would suggest that we need to do a little bit more of that, just to make sure, particularly the enabling works. You don't know with historic buildings until you start to open them up what nasties are in there. And that can cause problems if those are discovered during the process. So obviously we're looking for value for money still in development grants, but that's something that to consider when you're making your applications.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I want to start by perhaps thinking about those projects that are actually on site at the moment or in counting these problems. And I don't know if anybody, we don't want too many tales of woe today, but if there's anybody among the attendees who's got particular issues at the moment, who's got a project actually on site with particular, and then we'll go on later to talk about when we're planning for projects and when we're procuring contractors and so on, what we need to do. But any particular issues people want to talk about, you can either use the raise hand thing which is in reactions at the bottom, or actually raise your hand, or pop something in the chat to say you want to speak. Anybody? There was somebody earlier who told us about their so far back in the chat I can't find it now, who was telling us about their increases in costs.
It was Crystal.
Crystal, I can see you waving there. Hi, Crystal.
Hiya. So I'm working with Tittle Old Chapel Trust, and it's a project that's been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Historic England. We've had quite a lot of delays because of COVID with architects on furlough and that kind of thing. We've just had, so we went out to tender. We had real trouble because we could only have we had to shortlist down quite early on with the PQQ because we've got very specific COB heritage restoration skills that were required, so there were only some contractors that could do it. So we went out to 6 contractors throughout the course of the tender process. 4 of them just dropped out, either because they didn't have the time to tender, they didn't feel that they could get all the subcontractor prices and everything that they needed. There was a lot of problem with that, with getting subcontractors to actually quote. So we had 2 that came in the end, and they both came in initially. They were so our project's only just over 300,000, and they were coming in at 600,000 and just over. We were expecting it to have gone up a bit from our round 2 application because we did do another QS assessment of it, and we knew that the prices had gone up slightly, but that kind of blew it out of the water for us. So the reasons that we've been given for that is partly for having to just put provisional sums in for a lot of the subcontractor work because they just couldn't get the quotes within the time frame. Fluctuating inflation and rising costs on materials.
Oh, I'm afraid
on site with all the COVID.
You've frozen, Crystal.
Everything was taking a bit longer. Oh, sorry.
No, you're
back now.
Back in the room. Well done.
Yeah, so the COVID restrictions on the number of people working in a confined space also had an impact. So there were lots and lots of different things that came together to cause that to happen. So we've then we've been keeping really close contact with our funders, who've been fantastic and really supportive. We've gone back to them and we've done a bit of value engineering, and we asked for just giving them a bit more time to try to get some more definite costs from subcontractors. They've come back in. We're still quite significantly over our budget, but we're just about to go through the process of going back to the lottery for an uplift through the kind of standard process. We've had some additional funding from Historic England as well, so there's been a real recognition from funders about the challenge, and they've been really supportive. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal. We've got an interesting one on the chat there. Project start being delayed as lack of worker accommodation due to high volume of local holiday bookings. So that's just another problem to compound all the others. Yes, it's certainly a phenomena that there are a huge number of yes, UK holiday bookings as we can't go overseas. So I guess we should start to talk about what we should do about this. And
David, sorry to interrupt. We've got someone with a hand up. I think it's Jonathan Lee. Is it Jonathan? It's JL20622.
Yes, Jonathan Lee. I'm the Townscape Heritage Officer with West Lindsey District Council, looking at the Historic Heart of Gainsborough THI project. We have had one of our keystone projects on a very prominent corner, a former pub site and retail with retail units, semi-derelict with accommodation over, has gone on pause, basically because the contractor I think was not it's just pre the application for grant on some other works which were enabling works. And unfortunately, the contractor was not tied in well by the owner on those works contractually. And so they've been able to come back with significant cost increases, which have put a pause on the project. And so that has been a problem. So I would say that the detail and clarity of tender documents and contractual tie-ins are obviously critical. Something else that has cropped up in our particular scheme, just to add to another layer of difficulty potentially and potential cost risers, is that we have been putting in bids recently for levelling up funds from central government, which obviously have a rather narrow time frame, i.e. to the end of this government, for those funds, if they're won, to be spent. And so when I was gaining letters of support from some of our existing project or property owners, their view was, well, hang on, if I'm going to potentially get more from the levelling up bid, why would I kick off my THI granted funded project now when I might get more later? So that was one thing. And the problem that I foresee nationally with levelling up funds, if they're contiguous with regionally with THI has schemes and other funded schemes, is that in a very narrow space of a couple of years, we'll have even more projects available. So there'll be even more shortages of conservation accredited architects and surveyors. There'll be even more pressure on planning and conservation officer resource. And there'll be even more pressure on the time for structural engineers and specialist contractors, which will obviously inflate their prices further. So I think you know, there are a lot of additional problems that we'll face as a result of additional funding into the heritage sector. So just a thought.
Thank you. Yes, that's yes, another bit of food for thought there about the yes, there are always those externalities with you know, big amounts of funding going into regeneration. Yes, and yes, the problem of governments working to short time frames, and this is just, yes, another one of those. I'd yes, if there's nobody else wants to tell us about their experiences, I'd like to ask our panel members now, perhaps focusing narrowly initially, and I know we'll go on to the lessons learned later for those people that are business planning and procuring at the moment, but for those people that are on site or have gone through their procurement processes and are experiencing those sorts of problems of delays or contractors coming back with increased costs and so on, what are the practical strategies that organizations can adopt? Eleanor, do you want to come in on this one?
Shall I kick off? Yeah, and I think I'd even sort of break it down to, as we've spoken about, that sort of point between tendering and actually having already started on site. So I'll perhaps start at the end of the chain with projects that are on site. The first and probably most obvious is obviously just to check your contract clauses and just to see where the risks lie and who is responsible in the event of rising prices, just so that you can kind of know to what degree you're exposed and to what degree your contractor's exposed. And that's important from 2 points of view. Obviously, if you're exposed, if there is something to say that the contractor can pass on rising prices, then that's obviously one thing that you need to be mindful within your budgets, if they are able to make claims for those additional costs. Even if you're not responsible for that, as we've spoken about, the project may still be delayed, whether or not that sort of falls down to the contractor's responsibility and you're entitled to claim damages for delays or what have you. You know, that's still a delay to your project, a delay to you being able to reopen or sort of begin your business plan. But the other side of it as well is just to be wary of your contractor, particularly some of these smaller contractors, because if they are tied in on your project and their other contracts to their prices that they may have tendered a year ago or longer, they will be paying the higher prices because they aren't able to fix their subcontractor prices necessarily all the time, and particularly now we're seeing supply chains sort of saying that it's pay on delivery, so even if you place the order they may not have guaranteed a price, and that can put their cash flow under real pressure. So just be really wary, I think, and just be talking to your contractor, and someone sort of said earlier about sort of working collaboratively with the contractor, be aware of what their cash flow situation is, because it doesn't do anyone any benefit if the contractor then goes bust, because they basically, you know, they've got caught in the middle between being held to the contract price with you but having to pay higher prices for their supply chain. And also just being wary as always of how much you're paying to the contractor on a monthly basis in their valuations, and just sort of being really keen on that cash flow cycle. So that's one thing to be aware of. The other side is that Liz mentioned earlier about the risk register. It's so important as a document, and particularly to try and make sure it's a costed risk register. And there's two exercises that you can do. One is to go through your risk register and actually cost all of those risks. So as well as whatever you may be facing now, go through all of your risk register across all risk items and think about what sort of amounts of money it might cost you if those risks are realised. And work that through with your QS, with your design team, with your contractor even. So you've got a real kind of understanding of what, you know, the absolute kind of worst case position might be. And then you can apply a factoring to that. So you use the likelihood of the risk occurring, perhaps 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and factor your contingency allowance against each one. And that then gives you a factored risk kind of pot. And that gives you a reasonable position of what the sort of more likely worst case, if I can phrase it in that way, is in terms of what level of contingency you ought to be having. And I think that's just a helpful exercise to go through, so that when you are thinking about how sure are you in your position and how much sort of safety net do you need in your reserves or in your additional fundraising to proceed with the project, on how much might you need to scale back, just so that you can kind of work within the parameters of your own funding kind of availability. It can just be a really useful exercise sense check to be doing, probably on a monthly or quarterly basis, and it will just help you to set it in context. Otherwise it can just be quite scary just looking at all the numbers and not knowing how to structure it or how to give yourself a framework. So that's sort of one sort of route, I suppose, that we've been finding has been helpful for people that are actually already on site, and help them consider how much they might need to value engineer or cut scope or try and phase, depending on what stage they're in the project.
Thank you, Eleanor. Stephen, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, everything that Ellie said is spot on, and I think, you know, building out from that, it's thinking about what scope can be reduced, which, you know, the longer you are into a project, obviously the harder it is. And you know, if you're finding that some of these risks are becoming apparent earlier on, then you have a fighting chance of reducing scope in a meaningful way that hopefully doesn't distract from the approved purposes of the project, and also allows it to be brought back into budget. Sometimes even having a kind of a shopping list of items available that you can, you know, look at reducing scope and kind of assess those value engineering options, and don't just assess them on a financial basis, assess them on a kind of project impact basis. You know, it's very easy to kind of see this rising cost situation and understand that a project is going to head over budget and take a bit of a slash and burn approach, which then, you know, you can lose the core essence of a project very quickly and really affect your business plan. So it's got to be kind of very carefully considered, any value engineering approach. And, you know, all the discussions that I think I've had with funders recently, there's a real recognition, particularly for projects that are in delivery, that there's a limit to how far scope can be trimmed. And the funders are investing in these projects for a reason. They're investing in them for all the great things that those projects will achieve. The last thing they want is for their investment to go into something which won't achieve those purposes. So that, you know, they're alive to that, and they're happy to have those conversations and will help where they can. And, you know, the deeper into the delivery of a project that you are, the more important those funder conversations are going to get. And again, you know, that's something that we know that funders are acutely aware of.
Yeah, and that's just to add that on the value engineering, the other thing to be wary of is as Stephen says, perhaps do identify a shopping list and try to look at rather than trying to skinny back across a broad range, if you can divide the project in so it's chunks that come out, not least because the amount of time you sort of then spend perhaps redesigning or trying to take it back to, you know, and all of that actually can quickly, or the knock-on implications can quickly kind of eat away at any savings you might achieve, and actually you find the redesign fees. So actually if you're more, although it may be more painful to find you're delivering less, it is better to do less better than it is to try and still achieve everything, but on a tighter budget. So then the other bit that I was just going to say is just talk to your contractors. Is there any way, particularly perhaps with some of the heritage sites where you may have some land available, you may have opportunities for storage, is there any early orders of materials that you can place to try and secure, particularly with some of those things with the long lead-in times? It is a lot harder for the smaller contractors that don't have the buying power of the larger contractors. So, you know, perhaps also talk to other projects around you. Can you place, you know, a mass order for steel or something, you know, to split between the projects or something, just to try and increase that buying power and secure the materials?
Thank you, Eleanor. Do Liz or Gordon want to come in on? Gordon.
Yeah, I'll come in just briefly. Just to agree with what's being said, particularly on the value engineering front. I think the phrase baby in bathwater sort of springs to mind, that it's a very useful process, but you've got to use it carefully, because you don't want to end up losing what makes as Liz said, the key things that we want to fund in the first place. I think, just as I said before, if you're talking to your funders, they know what's happening. If there is the scope for uplift processes like the lottery has, which is great, then very much talk to them about that. Even if there isn't, there's maybe other ways that we can help in terms of just more flexibility in timescales, more flexibility in moving costs around under kind of approved, you know, what costs have actually been approved from different funders. There's maybe extra flexibility that can be had there about actually, if we can spend this money on that now, that would really help free up things later on. Just keep talking to us, as I say. And if, you know, more so for, we talked about kind of looking at projects and trying to split them into chunks and prioritization and things. And I think that's obviously easier the earlier on in the process you are to look at where there's scope for a more phased approach. We've certainly seen some applications for extra development funding for groups that want to come back to us to revisit their existing plans. You know, get a bit more design team time to look at how they might structure it differently and structure the delivery differently, and that's certainly something that we can look at. And the other thing to say that is always an option, and it's got to be used with care, but it is a potentially powerful thing, is that you know, we at EHF, other organisations as well, can provide loan finance to help plug short-term fundraising gaps. And if you're on site, you need to pay your contractors, costs are going up, you need to buy yourself some time to do that fundraising, to bring in extra funding from elsewhere, then that is something that is an option sign that you should consider and potentially look at. You know, loans aren't as sexy as grants because you do have to pay them back, but they're a really useful tool in the toolbox that can really help get you through some squeaky periods sometimes. So just to flag, it's not just about grants. There's other types of support, financial support as well, and it's well worth you know, investigating those.
On that point, Gordon and Liz, I wonder if there's any organisations that are going for other types of funding, going to other funders rather than going to existing funders, or perhaps looking at things like crowdfunding or community shares. It struck me that crowdfunding appeals always rely on that idea of the time limited and the jeopardy, and this is a sort of very much a jeopardy situation. So it might be something that worked.
Yeah, we've had quite a few projects that have launched crowdfunding appeals quite successfully over the last year, for organisational support as well as support with particular projects, and have found that actually that's a new way of engaging with people, that they were reaching people that probably hadn't been involved in their projects previously. So they've broadened their audience as well as fundraising some more cash. So I mean, at the National Lottery Heritage Fund, obviously we're always looking for projects to search the wide range of sources of funding that they can bring into their projects. And when we're considering things like grant increases and uplifts, we particularly want to see that you're not just coming to the lottery with the additional funding requests that you need, you know, and it's hugely beneficial to have a look around and see who else you can work in partnership with. And we've found that all of the funders that we've worked with in the past have been very open and flexible during this period, so it's well worth having a conversation with them about it. I agreed with everything everybody was saying there about what you can do. The only couple of things I would add is about having good legal advice on your team. So if you haven't got budget for good legal advice, I would make sure you do consider that before you head into this sort of project. And we talked about a dialogue with the contractor and a dialogue with your design team. I think part of the being an informed client bit is knowing that you don't speak to all of them about everything all the time. You pick who you're having to see your discussions with, and you get the advice from the right people, and then go back, particularly with your contractor. But it is really important to have that dialogue. Try not to change your mind quite so much about what you're delivering, you know, try and avoid these late instructions and variations to what you're doing. Just kind of focus on the fact that you all are trying to deliver something in very difficult circumstances. So unless there's something really fundamental that you've identified that's not going to work, it's about working together to get to that shared goal at the end, I think.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we could move on now to talk about for those organisations here who are, well, in some ways it's fortunate, but you're doing it at a difficult period. But at least it's forearmed is forewarned. If you're currently business planning, if you're currently fundraising, if you're currently planning procurement, what can organisations be doing to sort of minimise the risks to their future projects? Who wants to start me on that? Eleanor, I think this is probably your
yeah, should I jump first? Yeah, I mean, well, there's several things, and I'll perhaps start from the sort of the tender point and perhaps just work a bit backwards, and just because it picks up on what Liz was saying about the legal advice. Particularly as you're going into tender and you're setting up your contract terms and conditions, there is a clause within the particularly JCC form of contract called the fluctuation options, which, to be honest, I think we've all been just crossing out for the last 20 years, and it's not really ever being used, but we are starting to see contractors request it, and that's just one to be very wary of and to take advice on, really, because that exposes you to those fluctuations, and I think because it basically gives the contractor ability to come back and claim if there is a significant change of price, depending on how it's worded. So that's one just to be wary of, and just to think about. We've sort of heard today about tender prices coming back so significantly over budget, and a lot of that is because the contractors are hedging their bets. They don't know which way the market's going to go. They don't know for how much longer it's going to keep going like this. And I spoke earlier about two-stage tendering, which can be one way, but it doesn't lock in your prices. And actually, one of the things we are sort of talking about, particularly when people are tight on money and tight on funds, actually, if you can hold off, it might not be a bad decision to sort of say, let's just see if this settles down. The general feeling is it's probably about a year it's going to take for the sort of to play through. And whilst, as sort of we were talking earlier, it's a bit like petrol prices. It's unlikely prices will come back down to what they once were. But what they might do is at least stabilise, and then at least you're planning with some greater degree of certainty. I mean, construction is never certain, but at least if they're stable, you know a bit more about what to expect and what you're budgeting for, what you're fundraising for. So that is a sort of genuine conversation to be had, and perhaps take advantage of some of the emergency grants that are available if you do have some urgent repair works that need doing, or you just need to stabilise your building to stop it from getting any worse, and perhaps just consider that timing as I say, no one's got a crystal ball, unfortunately, but it does feel like it needs to just sort of play itself out a little bit, and then at least you've got a bit more stability, which just makes it a lot easier to plan, even if it means prices have risen a bit more than they are now. But that also means that the prices you get back from your contractors will be a bit more realistic, because they won't be, you're asking them for a fixed price, so they inevitably are pricing in risk, or not even willing to tender, as we've heard today, or not willing to sign a contract. So I think that's one that's sort of worth considering if you're at the tender stage. You might also just consider early orders, but again, that's that you've got to have sort of fair confidence in going forward with that. Contractors will push you for that. It's worth resisting, because it does put you in a certain point of commitment, and is sort of pushing risk back onto you that you may not be able to withstand. And then otherwise, if you're in the development stage, we sort of touched about it, sort of delivery, but it is about developing your project in such a way that you can try and scope it, and yes, sort of treat it more as a master plan, perhaps. You know, this is the ideal, this is how we would deliver it in sort of sizable chunks. This is what, yes, there are efficiencies if we've got the scaffolding up once to do everything, but actually that might not be realistic. So where are our cut-off points? And setting up that shopping list right from day one, we tend to have that value engineering list running, because you've always got it as a reference point, and it also means you've got it at a point where you've discussed it under calm circumstances of how do we cut this project up if we need to, rather than when you're under pressure trying to get into contracts. You've already had those meaningful conversations with your stakeholders, with your funders, with your trustees, so that you're all kind of in agreement on what your priorities are, and you can do it sort of in a considered manner, and the design can be developed in that way, which is perhaps where Stephen, you might want to come in.
Yes, before you do, Stephen, there is a question here about, and perhaps you can respond to this. Isn't it reasonable for increased costs to be shared between contractors and project sponsors? And I think that points to something that Eleanor alluded to earlier about the risk of contractors going bust. That obviously, if you hold them to a very tight price, you know, that's another risk that you have along the way. Any thoughts about that, Stephen?
You know, we're talking about kind of where risk gets apportioned, I suppose, and you know, who takes what risk, and it's a decision to be made. As things stand at the moment, you know, with pressures on budgets not really being any different to the way they've been for many years, you know, it's still incredibly difficult to raise funds for the kind of projects that we're talking about, and projects tend to be quite tightly scoped in order to get those budgets. It's quite difficult for you know, employer organisations like the ones that we, most of us on this screen are, to accommodate fluctuations in costs. So, you know, we tend to then push the risk on the contractor, and that's the way that we tend to deal with it. It's not wrong, but it can create some quite tricky situations. And I think what I would say about that is that those cost pressures will come out somewhere. It's a bit of a kind of a pressure cooker type thing. You know, if you put the lid on tightly, you'll push the lid off at some point, and usually in a way that you're maybe not quite expecting and is quite difficult to manage. So how that manifests with contractors, you know, we've talked about the potential for contractors to go bust, and clearly that's a risk. Particularly with the rate of change that we're seeing at the moment, it's incredibly difficult for contractors to manage that if they've not got an outlet somewhere. So the outlet that we are seeing increasingly is disputes, and quite protracted, painful, costly disputes, which take the shine off projects. And, you know, we're talking about volunteer-led organisations here as well, who do it for love and passion. And then you find yourself in a dispute with a contractor for potentially years trying to resolve cost situation. So all of the things that kind of Ellie was saying earlier about being really clear on what your contract is and where those risks get apportioned, doing all that groundwork about risk management are all incredibly important to prevent that pressure cooker from ever coming to the boil, hopefully. And if it does, at least you know what your mechanisms are to try and deal with that situation. And you know, we've kind of talked about how that manifests itself in delivery, but I think just kind of, I guess, going back to that, you know, projects in development, so much of this hinges on really high quality, detailed information, so that the contractor doesn't feel like they're taking any particular risks on, because it's all been thought of in advance. It's I don't know, sometimes I liken kind of contract documents to IKEA furniture instructions. You know, if they're well written and they're clear, then you'll make a good piece of furniture at the end of it. If they're not, then it'll be wobbly and it'll fall over and you probably won't have enough screws and all of that sort of thing. And it's quite a helpful analogy for this kind of situation. You know, if you've got a really good set of contract documents, it's well drawn, you've got, you know, detailed specification and scope, then your chances of success become so much higher. I'd also pick up on the point that Liz made earlier about changes. Changes in delivery can be really, really painful, but they can also be quite painful in development as well, because, you know, design teams, I think, are becoming under increasing pressure now as well. I mean, from a kind of a Buttress perspective, I think what we're seeing now is a need to recruit quite quickly to accommodate the amount of work that's around. You know, we've talked about all these different funding streams, things like Levelling Up Fund, Future High Streets, High Street Heritage Action Zone, Community Renewal Fund. I'm sure I've missed several government initiatives that are out there at the moment. A lot of them are dealing with heritage projects. And you know, we're probably seeing the biggest investment in heritage projects we've seen in, certainly in my lifetime. It's enormous. And that's placing demands right across the supply chain. And we're now seeing it being very difficult to recruit, which means that pushes up salary costs, which means our overheads go up, which means we're passing that potentially on to clients and our fees are going up. Again, pressure cookers. You know, if we're being asked to make lots and lots of design changes, whereas normally we would potentially just kind of swallow that and crack on, that's not as easy to do now, and we need to pass some of that back onto our clients potentially. So, you know, think about those costs as well, and about how that design process works through in a way that is kind of smooth and intelligent and iterative, and that not one which is kind of going backwards on itself at times. And that's another really important way to kind of keep your costs consistent and stop them from rising at those early stages.
Is that not a sort of a constant dilemma that organisations have between, and perhaps it's particularly heightened at this current time, between, and it's on the design side, but also on the design of the project side, is that you want to have this very clear vision to convince people and to make sure, but you also want to be incredibly flexible at the same time to deal with the things that are going to come up, and perhaps perhaps the funders can respond to that, because I think it's that sort of clarity of vision and detail is something that we do to keep funders happy, but at the same time we've always got to be thinking, yes, there's going to be problems along the way, and we're going to have to revise this plan.
Before the funders jump in, I think just maybe one thing to say around that is that you know, the processes that we typically go through with all of these kind of projects are staged, and they, you know, might fit within a National Lottery Heritage Fund kind of staged framework, or they might fit within our IBA stages, usually some combination of the two. And those stages create opportunity to review and revise in a way that's kind of compatible with fee structures and funder structures and all of those kind of things. And we will kind of often advise our clients when they're briefing for projects to kind of quite carefully include those review periods, because they're the bit where change can happen very, very intelligently, really considered, both in terms of time and money. And using that really judiciously, particularly in this context of rising costs, helps right the way through the process. So, you know, build in post a delivery stage application that when you're successful, there's a review period, because you've had a few months and you'll have thought something, and that way, you know, the costs are known, and it's kind of a lot more simple to deal with. And I'll be quiet now.
How do our funders feel about it, Liz?
I think as funders, what we're looking for is clarity of vision, and that there's a justification for that vision in terms of what you're wanting to deliver, and particularly if you're reusing a historic building. And this comes back to my point about not letting your capital scheme run away from your business planning, because if you don't undertake those as parallel pieces of work, and you come to your business planning too late in stage, you'll find yourself going back over your capital plans to look at your design. So really, I think what we try and encourage you to do in the supporting information we ask you to supply with your applications is to really think through what need and opportunity are you trying to address, and is what you're doing an appropriate response to that need and opportunity, and is your vision something that can be delivered within that space, and actually work through that with your business planning and your initial concept ideas for your capital works before you progress into the detailed design stage. And then you shouldn't have, there's always going to be, as Stephen said, that's good practice to have pause and review stages so that you can just tweak those designs. But really, with these buildings, you're looking to create flexible spaces anyway, because you may have a very bespoke business plan now, but in another 20 years, there may not be the same need and demand for that business plan. So we're also looking for a bit of future proofing in terms of your building structure, so that your organisation can flex and adapt in the future as well. So those are the things I would just bear in mind.
Yeah, just to completely agree with what Liz is saying, that the earlier in the process you start the business planning elements, the better. It should not in any circumstances be a kind of thing you do at the last minute to get the funding. It's absolutely crucial and core. And I think you know, and the more flexibility you can build into those end uses, whatever they are, you know, the better. But I think what I always say to people is that the groups that seem to on average do really well are the ones that have that real clarity of vision of what they're trying to achieve overall at a high level, but with the flexibility below that, as we talked about, the details can change of how you deliver that vision, but the vision of what you're actually trying to do is often very clear. It's we're trying to deliver these sorts of services from this historic building is a clear high level vision. How you do that, there's a lot of devil in the details and lots of different ways to deliver that. And just as one example of that, I can't name the project specifically, but there's a project we've been involved in where it was going to be a £8 or £9 million all singing, all dancing project to deliver the vision of what the group wanted to achieve. After several iterations of trying to unsuccessfully apply to the National Luxury Heritage Fund, they were knocked back. They revisited their original plans. They start again from blank sheet of paper, and the project's just about to open. And I think it's about a £1.5 to £2 million project now, and they're still delivering the complete vision of what they wanted to achieve from that project, but at a completely different level of cost than was originally envisioned, just with a completely different approach to it. So it can, but the vision has not been compromised, and that's the key thing. I think the other thing just to touch on briefly is, you know, this is a Heritage Trust Network meeting, we're the Architectural Heritage Fund. Lots of the projects that we deal with and lots of the projects around the virtual table here are not heritage projects. You're delivering services, you're doing stuff that happen to be in a historic building. And that means there's lots of other potential funding. Don't just look at, as Liz said earlier, don't just go to the Heritage Lottery and say, well, the Heritage, you're the only game in town. There's quite often lots of smaller funders, which is usually time consuming to go to, but what is it you're doing? Is it social housing? Is it, you know, community services? Is it childcare? Is it, you know, a mixture of these things? Are there any specialist funders that can help plug that? And you'll be doing all that anyway, because all funding packages are big, messy conglomerations of different funders these days. But don't pigeonhole yourselves in a particular category. Try and look beyond where you can, and you know, and just, you know, sell yourself. You're doing regeneration. You're regenerating neighborhoods. You're bringing people in. There's a huge well-being. You're doing placemaking. You're doing all these things. You're doing all these buzzwords in every single project around here, just about. And you know, don't be afraid to shout about those things positively.
Yes, and I think we can learn from what some of our members have been doing over the past year in making sure that sites are accessible, that they're accessible virtually, that they're using outdoor spaces as well. So if we have to, you know, as Eleanor suggests, the best strategy might be to wait, to delay, but that doesn't mean not delivering outcomes. There are outcomes in terms of involving people in the heritage or delivering services that could be delivered even though you haven't got your building. So, you know, I think we've had some great experiences of doing that over the past year. Anybody want to come in? Any questions for our panel? We did have a question, well, as a comment from Caroline here about funders pushing to spend money by a certain time, which means we have to skip design stages to meet their deadlines. Could you be more flexible? I'm not sure that's true of the funders we have here today, but perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
We do our best to be flexible. I think depending on the type of funder it is, we also have our own constraints on when we need to spend and how money has to be thingied as well. And we do our best to be as flexible as we can within our own constraints. That's not, you know, that's not to say there isn't more we could potentially do. I know there's a lot of discussions between funders, particularly in the last year, to talk about how we can better help you deliver your projects, because that's why we're here at the end of the day. But if there's specific examples or specific funders, I'll just reiterate, talk to them, see if there's anything they can do, encourage them to talk to each other if they're not, but they generally are, I think it's fair to say. Liz?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Gordon, absolutely. I mean, we try and be as flexible as we possibly can. I think where we do have sort of end dates, it's because we appreciate as well that if you come to us with a project idea and then 3 years passes, what we don't want to do is hold you to the structure of a project that actually no longer works for you anymore. So if you're wanting to extend your development phase because potentially you're facing all kinds of challenges about the delivery of something you thought 3 years ago was perfectly achievable, we'd actually rather you came to us and said, I don't think this is achievable anymore, and we're going to end that here at the development stage. We're going to take that information and use that to go not back to square one, because you'll have built up a lot of intelligence and information and data, but just go back to the drawing board slightly and come back in at round one and deliver something that actually fits all the changes that we've been through over the last year or so. So all I would say is we will extend, we will be flexible, but also sometimes the best thing to do if something isn't working is to draw a line under it and start again. And we've heard that story. One of the things I find the most inspiring about being involved in the Heritage Trust Network is that we've heard presentations from trusts that have said, we were on this track, we thought we were going to deliver this project successfully, and then this happened, and it was a complete car crash, and it all went wrong, and we all thought, well, forget it, it's never going to happen. But then we gathered ourselves together again, and we had another go, and it worked the second or the third or the fifth time, you know. So it's not a failure. These buildings are heritage at risk for a reason. It's because they've got lots of issues to work through, and you might not win the first time, but don't give up is the message.
I think that comment about flexibility of deadlines probably more applies to sort of public sector type funding, regeneration type funding, which may be tied to financial years or election cycles or whatever. And there's always that, you know, that phrase, spade ready projects that we want yes, which can put pressure on projects to get into delivery without enough sort of consideration.
And they never are shovel ready in my experience.
Sorry?
They never are shovel ready in my experience either. It takes a few shovels to get it started.
And I think yeah, just on that, because one of the things, particularly all the funds that have kind of, you know, been coming out recently, that we've just been talking to our clients about is actually what are we using the funding for, because they sort of see the money, and because funding is such a difficult issue, they sort of feel that they almost obliged to apply for it because it's there. And actually sort of we've had one instance where it probably caused us more harm than good going for it, because it meant we did push on with a bit of the project that was out of sequence and didn't make sense to, and actually it's sort of has ended up costing them twice, you know, perhaps what it maybe should have done, because we've had to accelerate it. It's been done out of sequence. It's caused some sort of knock-on operational challenges. So I think sometimes the funding is, and I can completely understand, you know, you want to go for every money that's sort of offered and available, but sometimes it's a harder decision, but perhaps better decision to sort of trust in your own fundraising, you know, abilities, that this might not be the fund. If you can't meet the timescales, then maybe that isn't the fund to go for. And the other bit I just want to pick up was in the comments about the sharing the pricing and the cost risks and things with the contractors. I think that's absolutely true. And I think what I found really kind of heartening over the last year during COVID, particularly in, you know, not so much in commercial sector because that does operate differently, but particularly in sort of public and third sector, is where, you know, under a lot of the contracts, it was down to the contractor to pick up the COVID costs and related costs because it counted as force majeure. And I'm sure you sort of read a lot about that in the press, but actually what we did see was you know, we had open conversations with our clients and we did look at sharing those costs and sharing those risks, so that, because overall that is beneficial to the project. Is the project getting delivered? And putting the contractor under too tight, as Stephen says, that pressure cooker, and also you will start to get, you know, just erroneous claims because they've got to make their money, they're trying to make a living. So that is absolutely, I think, and I think it has been good to see that over the last year, and hopefully that will continue in the certain times we're in at the moment, which is where that early engagement of contractor and two-stage tendering can actually be a benefit if it's managed well, and that's the key thing, is it's managing it well and making sure everyone's clear under what terms and conditions they're entering into, and where the cost risks are.
I was just going to agree with Ellie's point there about that very short term, you know, funding. You've got to spend it in this time scale. Difficult as it is to say no to funding, as we said, sometimes if it's not right for your project now, don't take it. If it's going to cause more problems or actually have potentially more damaging, it's okay to say no or to not take every opportunity. If it's not the right time, you know, there will be other opportunities. If it's not the right time now, it can do more damage than good. And as you say, desperately trying to rush in and do everything in a really short time scale. We've seen that in a few projects recently. You know, it can work, but it's not a lot of fun for all concerned. So, you know, be very aware of what you're signing up to and what the strings are for any funding that you're going for.
Yeah, so these point about talking to contractors, talking to tenderers. I think, Ellie, you talked earlier about the need to sort of you know, interrogate the contracts and so on, but is it also about sort of interrogating what their business model is, and whether, you know, there's always the danger that people are underbidding, and you're tempted to go with somebody because there's a really good price, but is it a question of also interrogating what's behind that good price? Oh.
I'm not sure if Ellie's just dropped out briefly, so I'll start to try and answer that, and Ellie can correct me when she comes back. I think it's really interesting times at the moment. I don't think many contractors are finding it difficult to find work. So we're in the unusual situation where I don't think we're seeing contractors underpricing particularly. If anything, it's the opposite. You know, the pricing in risk because they know there are plenty of opportunities around and they don't need to be quite as sharp with their pencils at the moment as they might have been under other circumstances. So that we're having a kind of a different set of challenges at the moment, I think. And you know, the need to interrogate tenders is actually more about where costs are kind of being inflated, and you know, are those inflated costs things which are going to create risks later in the project if there are variations and the like. So I mean, you know, maybe a silly example, but you might find two tendering contractors who've got some masonry repairs to do, you know, repointing works, and you don't quite know if the scope's going to be 100 square meters or 150 square meters. In that circumstance, you'd want to go with the one with the cheapest rate, because then you're protecting yourself from some of those price variations. And it's that sort of kind of intelligent consideration of tender prices that becomes really important when costs are kind of inflating in the way that they are. And now Ellie's back, I think, so I've done a bit of padding for her.
So
more thinking, Stephen, of, for example, your example from the Midlands earlier that you talked about with a range between 15 and 150%. You know, is it wise to go with the 15% one? You know, is it actually the 150% one that's the realistic one?
It could be, and I think it's each project has a different set of circumstances and different emphasis and a different group of contractors pricing it, and it just has to be gone through kind of rigorously and intelligently to determine you know, whether that cost is appropriate, and business model does play a part. So, you know, for example, if that contractor is using a subcontract supply chain to do, you know, a significant proportion of the works, then they're probably not as well protected from price variances as one who has a lot of in-house labour, particularly if that in-house labour is doing the lion's share of the work on that project. So, you know, some consideration of who you're going out to tender to and whether they're suitable for the work that you're doing becomes really important, as well as looking at their tender returns in that light. Is also, you know, really important. So it's a valid point.
Ellie.
Yeah, sorry, I think I got the gist of the question. I think exactly that, and that question you ask about, you know, is actually the 150% price the right price? It is something that's worth looking. And the way to perhaps, and is that intelligence, but the way particularly what we pay attention to is where you've got a massive range within individual items, because those are the items where the risk is. If you've got sort of one contractor that's just generally higher across the board, but all of the prices are generally sort of consistent and they're more or less in the same order across the tenders, then you know those items are probably priced about right. And it's the ones where you've got a lot of divergence, means that either people aren't quite understanding the tender documents properly or understanding what the work requires, or they've not been able to secure supply chain prices and so they've just put sort of rates in, or they think the quantity has been massively underscaled because they know there's going to be a variation for that later, and that's where they're going to come in and make their money, basically, you know, that, you know, and they've priced it in that way. So I think that's where that intelligence that Stephen kind of spoke of comes in, being quite important. But the other side of it, and again during the tender process, is if you can identify those ones where you think the risk items are, then it might be that you can treat those as a discrete sort of set of conditions, so that you end up with a contract where you perhaps have a fixed price for these items that are perhaps within the contractor's control, that, you know, there isn't too much fat, isn't too much risk priced into them. They're certain, you know, you're certain the scope of works, they're certain they can deliver that scope of works, and that gets sort of set up as one set of conditions. And then there might be a number of items that you do treat either as approx quantities or as provisional sums that you agree are done on a remeasure basis, and that can perhaps be a fairer way of sharing that risk. So, you know, that's where having that legal advice, that contract advice, can be really important, because it's getting contracts are basically about where does the risk get apportioned, as we've spoken about a lot today, and getting tailored advice, particularly in this current sort of set of conditions, to suit your attitude to risk, your ability to contain risk, and your ability to contain kind of cost overruns, but also how much you balance that with the contractors, means that actually you can get the right balance that works for your contract, for your project. And often it isn't just a set of blanket JCT contract terms. A more tailored approach probably gets the best result for everyone.
Okay, that's really interesting. So that's the questions we had earlier about sharing risk. It's sharing risk isn't an either or. There can be areas where we're sharing risk and areas where we're absolutely, you know, have very fixed prices. So.
And just maybe to add to that, it's worth thinking about where the contractor and their supply chain can really add value to projects. So, you know, we talk about contractor design. That is also something which comes with lots of shades of grey, where we perhaps see the best gains from contractors and their supply chains is with mechanical and electrical installations, particularly the larger pieces of plant and equipment, where special relationships that they might have to purchase items of kit, they can make some really significant gains for no loss in quality. So it is about where you can open up the contract to allow the contractor to, you know, take some financial reward from their perspective, but also add some really significant, you know, value to the project. And where you can open up areas to share that risk, and done intelligently, it can keep that pressure cooker off the boil.
Just sorry, very final one on that is just the other bit about contractor input is actually some of the design, which also helps from a sustainability point of view, but for sort of minimising wastage. Just we've got a job where it's an interior fit out, but there's a lot of MDF panels going, and just by designing the structure so that it works to standard MDF sizes, reduces the quantity of material that we need, and therefore quantity of wastage, and therefore keeps down cost. But also it's, you know, from a sustainability point of view. So actually just, you know, being aware of the materials you're using and asking contractors from that point of view, you know, what's the efficient way of building that as well, which can be helpful.
Okay, that's really interesting, and perhaps a sort of demands of you know, volunteer boards of organisations are sort of much more attention to detail than perhaps we've been used to doing in the past. Really, it's you know, I think previously we thought, oh well, we get some prices in and we have some advisors who tell us about it and so on, but perhaps there's a need to engage with the detail a lot more than we've been used to doing. Okay, it's 5 to 1. I want to go and have my soup, and I'm sure you all do too. I'd just like to ask our speakers to perhaps, if I just whiz around quickly and just say, you know, in the current circumstances, if there's one thing that you can advise people to do that sums up today, what would that one thing be? And I'll start this time with our funders. So Liz, put you on the spot there. What's the one thing?
I would say communication is the important thing. I mean, that's been a theme running through the discussion today. Communication with your funders, communication with your design team, communication with your contractor, and as a team, we'll get through it.
Gordon?
I just reiterate that, as communication, talk to us. We're all in it together in a certain sense, so we all want you to succeed.
Who's next? Stephen? Don't
give up. You know, all these hurdles, you can get over them. You just got to work through them and don't give up. You know, there's great projects to deliver and lots of passion out there, and yeah, just keep on going with it.
And Ellie?
I'll do the counter to that and say also don't be afraid to take the difficult decisions. Sometimes just pressing on may not be the right thing. So yeah, I think, but make sure it happens overall, but it might be sometimes it's, yeah, take the hard decisions.
So maybe don't giving up means giving up for a little bit in order to come back stronger. Okay, well, thank you very much. Bev has pointed out that we have an event coming up on the question of risk on the 15th of July, which is, you know, very pertinent to what we've been talking about today. And we have people speaking at that event who are both project managers who get very excited by risk registers and people from the insurance industry as well. So that should be also a very informative event for anybody who's embarking on a project at the moment. So big thank you to all our speakers. I think what we'll try and do is try and this will be available as a as a recording to look at on our websites, but it can be a bit tedious to sit through a recording again. Maybe we'll try and write some of this up as sort of bullet points, try and extract some of the wisdom we've had today and have it as a news item or something in our toolkit. But watch this space and we'll let you know what we've done with that, and we'll try and yes, make sure that what's been some really excellent advice today is more widely available. So thanks again to all our speakers, and thanks to you all for coming and for your interesting questions and comments. And we'll see you again at a future event.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
And thanks to Bev in the background, who's been sorting out all the technology. Thanks, Bev.